Welcome to part 5 of Pride and Prejudice Reimagined. Today, we take the classic book and reimagine it in the style of best-selling romance author Carolyn Brown. If you enjoy this content, please take a minute to like, subscribe, or share this video. You can also hit the bell to be notified of new classic books reimagined as soon as they are published here on YouTube. If there is a classic book you would like to hear reimagined in the style of a modern author, please leave it in the comments.
Chapter 41 Farewells and New Beginnings. The first week of their return flew by in a blur, and the second week began with a sense of melancholy in the air. It was the final week of the regiment's stay in Meryton, and the young ladies of the neighbourhood were drooping like wilted flowers. Kitty and Lydia were particularly devastated, unable to comprehend how their elder sisters, Jane and Elizabeth, could remain so composed, eating, drinking, and going about their usual routines. "What will become of us? What are we to do?" Lydia wailed dramatically. "How can you be smiling, Lizzie?" Their mother, Mrs. Bennet, shared in their sorrow, reminiscing about her own heartbreak 25 years ago when Colonel Miller's regiment left. "I cried for 2 days straight," she sighed. "I thought my heart would break." "I'm sure mine will break," Lydia declared with equal melodrama. "If only we could go to Brighton," Mrs. Bennet mused longingly. "Yes, if only," echoed Lydia. "But Papa is so disagreeable." "A little sea bathing would do wonders," Mrs. Bennet added. "And Aunt Phillips says it would do me a world of good," Kitty chimed in. Their lamentations echoed through Longbourn House, but Elizabeth found no humour in them. Instead, she felt a deep sense of shame. She saw the truth in Mr. Darcy's criticisms of her family and began to understand his interference in Bingley and Jane's relationship. However, Lydia's gloom was soon dispelled by an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the Colonel's young, recently married wife, to accompany her to Brighton. Lydia was over the moon, bouncing around the house in a frenzy of excitement, calling for congratulations, while Kitty sulked in the parlour, feeling slighted. "Why didn't she ask me too?" Kitty complained. "I'm older than Lydia." Elizabeth tried to reason with her, while Jane attempted to soothe her. Elizabeth, far from sharing her mother's and Lydia's enthusiasm, saw the invitation as a recipe for disaster. She secretly advised her father against letting Lydia go, highlighting her sister's imprudence and the potential for greater folly in Brighton. Mr. Bennet listened patiently and then said, "Lydia will never be content until she has made a spectacle of herself. We might as well let her do it now, with minimal cost and inconvenience to the family." "If you knew the damage her behaviour has already caused us," Elizabeth argued, "you'd think differently." "Has she scared off some of your suitors?" Mr. Bennet teased. "Don't fret, Lizzie. Those who can't handle a bit of silliness aren't worth your time." "It's not just about me, Father. Lydia's wild behaviour affects our entire family's reputation." Mr. Bennet took her hand affectionately. "Wherever you and Jane are known, you will be respected. We can't have peace if Lydia doesn't go to Brighton. Colonel Forster is sensible and will keep her out of trouble. At Brighton, she'll be less important than here. The officers will find more suitable women to flirt with, and she might learn her own insignificance. Besides, she can't get into too much trouble without money." Elizabeth left the conversation feeling unsatisfied, but resigned. She had done her duty by speaking up, and worrying further was not in her nature. Had Lydia and Mrs. Bennet known about Elizabeth's interference, their indignation would have been boundless. For Lydia, Brighton represented the pinnacle of happiness, an endless parade of officers, flirtations, and social events. She imagined herself the belle of the ball, captivating countless admirers. Unaware of Elizabeth's concerns, Lydia's excitement continued unabated until the day of her departure. Elizabeth saw Mr. Wickham one last time, having spent enough time with him since her return to Meryton to realise that his initial charm was all too superficial. His attempts to rekindle their earlier flirtation only provoked her. On the final day of the regiment's stay, Wickham dined with the Bennets and other officers at Longbourn. Elizabeth, disinclined to part on friendly terms, mentioned her time at Hunsford and the presence of Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy at Rosings. Wickham looked alarmed, but recovered quickly, asking about Colonel Fitzwilliam. Elizabeth replied warmly about Colonel Fitzwilliam, noting that Mr. Darcy improved on acquaintance. Wickham's surprise was evident. "Indeed? And how has he improved? Has he become more civil?" "No, his manners remain the same," Elizabeth said. "But understanding his disposition better has changed my perception." Wickham's face flushed, and he struggled to maintain his composure. "I'm glad he tries to appear better. His pride might deter him from misconduct, especially around his aunt, Lady Catherine." Elizabeth smiled but said nothing more, recognizing his attempt to elicit sympathy. They spent the rest of the evening with strained civility, each secretly relieved at the prospect of never meeting again. As the evening drew to a close, Lydia left with Mrs. Forster, her departure more noisy than heartfelt. Kitty was the only one to shed tears, though out of envy rather than sorrow. Mrs. Bennet lavished good wishes on Lydia, urging her to enjoy herself to the fullest. In the clamour of farewells, the more sincere goodbyes of her sisters went unheard. Elizabeth felt a mix of relief and apprehension as she watched Lydia leave, hoping the experience would not end in disaster. For now, she could only wait and see what the future held for her impetuous sister. Chapter 42. Elizabeth's New Perspective. Elizabeth Bennet's outlook on life had been shaped in no small part by observing her own family. The Bennet household was a lively one, but far from the ideal picture of domestic bliss. Mr. Bennet, lured by youth and beauty, had married Mrs. Bennet, a woman whose limited understanding and frivolous nature soon extinguished any real affection he had for her. Respect and esteem had vanished early in their marriage, leaving him to find solace in books and the countryside. His wife's ignorance and folly were sources of amusement to him, a sad consolation indeed. Elizabeth, though always aware of the impropriety of her father's behaviour as a husband, tried to overlook it out of gratitude for his affection towards her. Yet the constant breach of conjugal decorum, which exposed her mother to the contempt of her own children, pained her deeply. She had never felt as strongly as she did now the disadvantages of such an ill-suited marriage. Talents, if rightly used, might have preserved the respectability of his daughters, even if they couldn't improve his wife's mind. With Wickham's departure, Elizabeth had hoped for a sense of peace, but the loss of the regiment meant fewer social engagements, and the atmosphere at home grew even more dismal. Mrs. Bennet and Lydia's constant complaints about the dullness of life cast a gloom over the household. Kitty, though likely to regain her senses now that the regiment was gone, remained influenced by Lydia's foolishness. To lift her spirits, Elizabeth turned her thoughts to an upcoming tour of the lakes. It became her beacon of hope amidst the dreariness, her best consolation for the discomfort caused by her mother's and Kitty's discontent. Including Jane in this plan would have made it perfect, but Elizabeth cherished the anticipation nonetheless. "It's fortunate to have something to look forward to," she mused, knowing that complete satisfaction in any plan was a rare thing. Lydia, before leaving, had promised to write often. However, her letters were few and brief, filled with descriptions of new gowns and social outings rather than meaningful news. As the weeks passed, the household's mood gradually improved. The families who had been away for the winter returned, bringing with them the vibrancy of summer engagements. Mrs. Bennet reverted to her usual querulous serenity, and Kitty began to show signs of recovery, even venturing into Meryton without tears. The eagerly anticipated tour to the lakes was now just a fortnight away when a letter from Mrs. Gardiner arrived, delaying their plans. Business would keep Mr. Gardiner in London until mid-July, shortening their trip and forcing them to substitute a shorter tour of Derbyshire instead. Elizabeth, though disappointed, resolved to make the best of it. The mention of Derbyshire brought Pemberley to mind, and she wondered if she might visit without encountering Mr. Darcy. The Gardiners arrived at Longbourn with their 4 children, bringing a breath of fresh air. Jane, with her gentle demeanour, was perfect for looking after her young cousins, while Elizabeth prepared for the journey. They set off the next morning, the promise of new experiences lifting Elizabeth's spirits. Their route through the countryside was delightful. Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, and Birmingham were all stops along the way, but their main focus was on the small part of Derbyshire where Mrs. Gardiner had once lived. Lambton, her former residence, was near Pemberley, which sparked a conversation about visiting the grand estate. "My dear, wouldn't you like to see Pemberley?" Mrs. Gardiner asked one evening. "It's a place of such beauty, with many fine connections." Elizabeth hesitated, thinking of Darcy. "I'm rather tired of touring grand houses, but the grounds do sound lovely," she replied, trying to sound indifferent. Mrs. Gardiner chuckled. "It's not just the house, but the woods and the landscape. You would love it." That night, Elizabeth's curiosity grew. She discreetly asked a chambermaid about Pemberley and its owner, learning with relief that the family was away for the summer. The next morning, she agreed to the visit with a calm she didn't quite feel. As they neared Pemberley, Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The possibility of seeing the grand estate without encountering Darcy was both a relief and a curiosity. With her aunt and uncle as delightful companions, she felt ready to embrace whatever the visit might bring. To Pemberley they would go, and Elizabeth's heart fluttered with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. Chapter 43. Discovering Pemberley. As Elizabeth and her relatives drove along the winding country road, she felt a flutter of excitement and anxiety in her chest. Pemberley Woods loomed ahead, and she watched intently for her first glimpse of the famed estate. When they finally turned in at the lodge, her spirits soared and her heart raced. The park was vast and full of variety. They entered through one of its lowest points and wound their way through a beautiful wood that seemed to stretch endlessly. Elizabeth, lost in her thoughts, admired every remarkable spot and point of view they passed. The carriage gradually ascended, and they soon found themselves atop a considerable hill where the woods gave way to a stunning vista. There it was, Pemberley House, a grand stone building standing proudly on rising ground, backed by high wooded hills. In front of the house, a natural stream swelled gracefully, its banks free of any artificial embellishments. Elizabeth was captivated. She had never seen a place where nature's beauty was so perfectly preserved, unspoiled by awkward human touches. The admiration in the carriage was unanimous, and for a fleeting moment Elizabeth imagined what it might be like to be the mistress of such a place. They descended the hill, crossed a charming bridge, and arrived at the front door. As they examined the house up close, Elizabeth's earlier apprehension about possibly encountering Mr. Darcy returned. She dreaded that the chambermaid might have been mistaken about his absence. Nevertheless, they were welcomed into the grand hall, and Elizabeth marvelled at finding herself in such a place. The housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, soon arrived. She was a respectable-looking elderly woman, much more civil and less pretentious than Elizabeth had expected. Mrs. Reynolds led them into a large, well-proportioned dining room, handsomely furnished but not ostentatious. Elizabeth, after a quick survey, went to the window to take in the view. The hill they had descended, now distant and even more beautiful, framed the river and the scattered trees along its banks. Every window offered a different perspective of the stunning landscape. As they toured more rooms, each one equally lofty and elegant, Elizabeth noted that the furnishings, though fine, were practical and tasteful, quite unlike the gaudy splendour of Rosings. She thought to herself, I might have been the mistress of this place, welcoming my uncle and aunt as guests, had things been different. But she quickly reminded herself that such a scenario was impossible. Her uncle and aunt would not have been welcome in Mr. Darcy's world. She wanted to ask Mrs. Reynolds if Mr. Darcy was truly absent, but lacked the courage. Finally, her uncle posed the question, and Elizabeth turned away nervously as the housekeeper confirmed he was expected the next day with a large party of friends. Elizabeth was relieved their journey hadn't been delayed. Her aunt called her to admire a miniature portrait over the mantelpiece. It was Mr. Wickham, Mrs. Gardiner noted with a smile. Mrs. Reynolds explained he was the son of the late steward and had been brought up by Mr. Darcy's father, but had turned out quite wild. Elizabeth felt a pang of embarrassment, unable to return her aunt's smile. Mrs. Reynolds then pointed to another miniature, saying, "That's my master, Mr. Darcy, drawn about 8 years ago." Mrs. Gardiner commented on his handsome face, asking Elizabeth to confirm its likeness. The housekeeper's respect for Elizabeth seemed to grow upon learning she knew Mr. Darcy. "Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy?" Mrs. Reynolds asked. Elizabeth blushed. "A little." "And do you not think him a very handsome gentleman, ma'am?" "Yes, very handsome. I'm sure there is no one so handsome. In the gallery upstairs you'll see a finer, larger picture of him. This was his father's favourite room, and the miniatures are just as they were then." They moved on to a portrait of Miss Darcy, drawn when she was 8. Mr. Gardiner inquired if she was as handsome as her brother. Mrs. Reynolds assured them she was, adding she played and sang beautifully, and would be arriving with Mr. Darcy the next day. Mr. Gardiner's easy manners encouraged Mrs. Reynolds to share more about the Darcy family. She praised Mr. Darcy as a kind and generous master, much like his father. Elizabeth listened with astonishment, her preconceived notions of Mr. Darcy challenged by the housekeeper's glowing account. As they ascended the grand staircase, Mrs. Reynolds continued to extol Mr. Darcy's virtues. "He is the best landlord and master, not like the wild young men nowadays who think only of themselves. Some call him proud, but I've never seen it. He just doesn't rattle away like other young men." Elizabeth marvelled at how this favourable description contrasted with her previous impression of him. Mrs. Gardiner whispered, "This doesn't quite match his behaviour towards our poor friend." "Perhaps we were mistaken," Elizabeth suggested. When they reached the gallery, they admired several fine paintings and portraits, though Elizabeth was primarily interested in finding one particular face. Finally, she stood before Mr. Darcy's portrait, captivated by his familiar smile. She lingered there, her feelings softening towards him as she recalled his letter and his kindness. As they concluded their tour, they were met by the gardener, who was to show them the grounds. They walked across the lawn towards the river, and Elizabeth turned back for one last look at the house. Her uncle speculated about its construction date when suddenly Mr. Darcy himself appeared from a path behind the house. Their eyes met, and both blushed deeply. Mr. Darcy approached with perfect civility, though visibly surprised. Elizabeth, instinctively turning away, managed to respond to his inquiries about her family with some embarrassment. The contrast between his current politeness and his last, more formal encounter at Rosings left her bewildered. After a brief, awkward exchange, Mr. Darcy took his leave. Elizabeth, overwhelmed by the unexpected meeting, barely registered her uncle and aunt's praises of Mr. Darcy's demeanour. As they continued their walk along the river, Elizabeth's thoughts were entirely consumed by the encounter. When they rejoined the path towards the house, they were surprised again by Mr. Darcy's approach. This time, Elizabeth resolved to remain composed. Mrs. Gardiner introduced herself and Mr. Gardiner, and to Elizabeth's relief, Mr. Darcy did not retreat, but engaged Mr. Gardiner in conversation. Elizabeth was secretly pleased and proud of her uncle's manners and intelligence. The conversation turned to fishing, and Mr. Darcy extended an invitation to Mr. Gardiner to fish at Pemberley, offering equipment and advice on the best spots. Mrs. Gardiner exchanged a look with Elizabeth, expressing her astonishment. As they walked on, Mrs. Gardiner grew tired and switched to her husband's arm, leaving Mr. Darcy to walk with Elizabeth. She mentioned their unexpected arrival, and Mr. Darcy explained he had come ahead of his party, which included Mr. Bingley and his sisters. He also expressed a desire to introduce his sister to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, taken aback, agreed. She realised that despite past grievances, Mr. Darcy still held her in some esteem. They walked on in silence, each deep in thought, until they reached the carriage. Declining an invitation to rest inside, they stood together on the lawn. Small talk about their travels felt forced, and Elizabeth found herself anxious for her aunt and uncle to return. When they finally arrived, Mr. Darcy helped the ladies into the carriage with utmost politeness. As they drove away, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner expressed their admiration for Mr. Darcy. "He's perfectly well behaved and polite," Mr. Gardiner noted. "There is a certain stateliness to him," Mrs. Gardiner added, "but it suits him. I saw no sign of pride." Elizabeth was gratified by their approval, though she knew they misunderstood his true character. She shared what she had learned about Mr. Wickham, hoping to provide a more balanced view of Mr. Darcy's actions. Back at their destination, Elizabeth's thoughts remained on Mr. Darcy's surprising civility and his wish for her to meet his sister. It was a day full of revelations, leaving her to ponder the complexity of Mr. Darcy's character and her own evolving feelings. Chapter 44. A Visit from Pemberley. Elizabeth Bennet had convinced herself that Mr. Darcy and his sister would come to visit the day after her arrival at Pemberley, so she planned to stay close to the inn that morning. But, as life often surprises, they arrived unexpectedly the very morning after Elizabeth and the Gardiners reached Lambton. Elizabeth, who had been out enjoying a walk with her aunt and uncle, was just returning to the inn to freshen up for dinner when the sound of a carriage brought her to the window. Recognizing the Darcy livery, she turned to her relatives with wide eyes. "Mr. Darcy and his sister are here," she exclaimed, a mix of excitement and nerves in her voice. Her uncle and aunt exchanged curious glances, their surprise mirroring her own. As the Darcy carriage came to a halt, Elizabeth's heart pounded. She was filled with a sudden anxiety about meeting Miss Darcy, fearing that her brother might have spoken too highly of her. She retreated from the window, pacing the room in an effort to calm herself, while her uncle and aunt looked on with amusement. When Mr. Darcy and his sister Georgiana entered the inn, Elizabeth was struck by the young lady's beauty and grace. Tall and poised, with a shy demeanour, Georgiana was not at all as Elizabeth had imagined. Elizabeth, having heard tales of Georgiana's pride, was relieved to find her more reserved than haughty. "Miss Bennet," Mr. Darcy greeted, his voice warm and inviting. "May I introduce my sister, Georgiana?" Georgiana, dressed in a lovely lavender gown, managed a polite curtsy and a shy smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Bennet." "The pleasure is mine, Miss Darcy," Elizabeth replied, offering a reassuring smile. "I've heard much about you." As they conversed, it became clear that Georgiana was more nervous than Elizabeth. Her monosyllabic responses and timid glances made Elizabeth feel unexpectedly at ease. Not long into their visit, Mr. Darcy mentioned, "Bingley will be joining us shortly." Elizabeth barely had time to react before the sound of quick footsteps announced Bingley's arrival. He burst into the room with his usual good-humoured charm, his face lighting up at the sight of Elizabeth. "Miss Bennet, it's wonderful to see you again," he exclaimed, his genuine delight evident. Elizabeth couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. "Mr. Bingley, it's a pleasure." Bingley inquired about her family with such unaffected warmth that any lingering resentment Elizabeth might have felt melted away. He was the same affable and kind-hearted man she remembered, and it was clear that his feelings for Jane had not diminished. As they chatted, Elizabeth's mind wandered to Jane, wishing to know if Bingley still harboured feelings for her sister. Observing Bingley's interactions with Georgiana, Elizabeth was relieved to see no sign of particular attachment there. Instead, she detected a wistful longing in his eyes whenever he mentioned the past. "It's been quite some time since we were all together at Netherfield," Bingley remarked, his tone tinged with nostalgia. "Yes, it has," Elizabeth agreed, her heart hopeful. "November, wasn't it?" "Indeed," he replied, with a thoughtful look. "I remember it well." Throughout the visit, Elizabeth noticed a remarkable change in Mr. Darcy. He was polite and engaging, not just to her but to her aunt and uncle too. The stiff, aloof man she had known seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone genuinely eager to connect. When the visitors finally rose to leave, Mr. Darcy extended an invitation. "Miss Bennet, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, we would be delighted if you could join us for dinner at Pemberley the day after tomorrow." Georgiana, though shy, added, "We would love to have you." Mrs. Gardiner looked to Elizabeth for her thoughts. Seeing the slight turn of Elizabeth's head, she took it as a sign of modesty rather than reluctance, and agreed on behalf of their party. As they prepared to depart, Bingley expressed his joy at the prospect of seeing Elizabeth again soon. "I still have many questions about our friends in Hertfordshire," he said with a grin. Elizabeth, interpreting this as a desire to hear about Jane, felt a surge of happiness. She could hardly wait to share the news with Jane. Once the visitors left, Elizabeth sought a moment alone to process the morning's events. Her uncle and aunt had been discreetly observant, noting the warmth between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth. "Well, Lizzie," Mrs. Gardiner said, smiling knowingly, "it seems Mr. Darcy is quite taken with you." Elizabeth blushed. "He has certainly changed for the better," she admitted. "I find myself thinking of him more kindly than before." Mr. Gardiner nodded. "He appears to be a fine gentleman. Our housekeeper spoke very highly of him." Elizabeth retired to her room, her thoughts swirling with the day's revelations. She lay awake, pondering her evolving feelings for Mr. Darcy. The respect she had grudgingly acknowledged had grown into something warmer, fueled by his actions and the genuine regard he showed her family. The following morning, after breakfast, Mr. Gardiner left for a fishing expedition at Pemberley, while Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner prepared to call on Georgiana. The anticipation of seeing Pemberley and its charming occupants filled Elizabeth with a mix of excitement and nervousness. As they approached Pemberley, Elizabeth's heart raced. The grand estate, with its rolling hills and lush woods, was even more beautiful than she had imagined. The possibility of seeing Mr. Darcy again both thrilled and unsettled her. "Here we go," she thought, taking a deep breath. "Let's see what the day brings." And so, with a hopeful heart and a curious mind, Elizabeth stepped into the next chapter of her journey, ready to embrace whatever surprises awaited at Pemberley. Chapter 45. A Pemberley Gathering. Elizabeth felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension as their carriage rolled up the long drive towards Pemberley House. She was convinced that Miss Bingley's dislike of her stemmed from sheer jealousy, and she wondered just how civil their renewed acquaintance would be. Upon reaching the grand house, they were shown through a spacious hall into a lovely saloon. This northern-facing room was a perfect summer retreat, with its tall windows opening to the ground, offering refreshing views of the high, woody hills behind the house and the magnificent oaks and Spanish chestnuts scattered across the lawn. Georgiana Darcy, along with Mrs. Hurst, Miss Bingley, and Mrs. Annesley, received them. Georgiana, shy and reserved, greeted them with a politeness that could easily be mistaken for pride. Elizabeth and her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, saw through her shyness and felt pity rather than judgment. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley merely offered a cursory nod, and an awkward silence followed as everyone settled into their seats. Mrs. Annesley, an elegant and amiable woman, broke the silence with polite conversation, which was soon joined by Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth. Elizabeth noticed Miss Bingley's keen gaze following her every move, especially when she spoke to Georgiana. Though the distance between them made conversation challenging, Elizabeth found herself wishing both for and against Mr. Darcy's appearance. When Miss Bingley finally broke her silence with a cold inquiry about Elizabeth's family, Elizabeth responded with equal indifference, and the conversation fizzled out. The arrival of servants with an array of cold meats, cakes, and the finest fruits provided a welcome distraction. The beautiful pyramids of grapes, nectarines, and peaches drew everyone to the table, offering Elizabeth a chance to gauge her feelings about Mr. Darcy's arrival. Just as she was beginning to wish he wouldn't appear, he entered the room. Elizabeth had resolved to remain composed, knowing that all eyes, especially Miss Bingley's, were on them. Darcy greeted everyone with perfect civility, though Elizabeth noticed his particular concern for Georgiana and her getting acquainted. Miss Bingley, unable to contain her jealousy, seized the opportunity to make a snide remark. "Pray, Miss Eliza, are not the Shire militia removed from Meryton? They must be a great loss to your family." Elizabeth understood the veiled reference to Wickham and felt a moment's distress. She quickly composed herself and replied with a calm, disengaged tone. A glance at Darcy revealed his heightened colour and earnest expression. Georgiana, too, seemed flustered, unable to lift her eyes. Unaware of the pain she caused, Miss Bingley aimed to unsettle Elizabeth and diminish her in Darcy's eyes. However, Elizabeth's composed response soon quieted his unease. Miss Bingley's tactic backfired, as Darcy's thoughts seemed even more favourably fixed on Elizabeth. The visit concluded soon after, and as Darcy escorted them to their carriage, Miss Bingley vented her frustration with harsh critiques of Elizabeth's appearance. "How very ill Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy. She has grown so brown and coarse, Louisa and I barely recognised her." Darcy coolly replied, "I see no alteration, except that she is slightly tanned, a natural consequence of summer travel." Miss Bingley persisted, criticising Elizabeth's features and manners, but Darcy's patience wore thin. "When we first knew her in Hertfordshire, you found her rather pretty," she goaded. "Yes," Darcy finally responded, unable to contain himself, "but it has been many months since I've considered her one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance." Darcy then walked away, leaving Miss Bingley to stew in her own frustration. As they rode back, Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth discussed everything about their visit except the one person who occupied their thoughts the most. They talked about Georgiana, the house, and the fruit, skirting around their true interest, Mr. Darcy himself. Elizabeth longed to know what her aunt thought of him, while Mrs. Gardiner wished Elizabeth would broach the subject. Both kept their thoughts to themselves, savouring the new and unexpected dimensions to Mr. Darcy's character revealed that day. Chapter 46. Urgent News and Unexpected Visitors. Elizabeth Bennet was deeply disappointed when there was no letter from Jane awaiting her at the Lambton Inn. Each morning she hoped for news, and each morning brought only frustration. Finally, on the third day, her patience was rewarded with 2 letters from Jane, one of which had been misdirected. Elizabeth wasn't surprised, given Jane's hastily scrawled handwriting. Just as Elizabeth was about to join her aunt and uncle for a walk, the letters arrived. Her relatives, sensing her eagerness, left her to read them in peace. The missent letter was first. It began with the usual cheerful updates on Meryton's social scene, but took a drastic turn halfway through, dated a day later, and written in visible agitation. "Dearest Lizzie, since my last letter, something most unexpected and serious has occurred. But please, do not be alarmed. We are all well. This concerns poor Lydia. Late last night, just as we were going to bed, we received an express from Colonel Forster. Lydia has run off to Scotland with Mr. Wickham. Imagine our shock. Kitty seemed less surprised, though. I am very, very sorry. Such an imprudent match. But I hope his character has been misunderstood. This step at least shows he must care for her, knowing our father can give her nothing. Our mother is devastated, but my father is bearing it better. I am relieved we never shared what has been said against Wickham. We must forget it ourselves. They left Saturday night, but were not missed until the next morning. Colonel Forster is trying to find them. Lizzie, they must have passed within 10 miles of us. I must attend to our mother now. I hope you can read this." It was written in haste. Elizabeth's hands shook as she finished the letter. Without pausing to think, she tore open the second letter, which was written a day later. "By now, you've received my hurried letter. I wish this one makes more sense, but my mind is in such a state. Dearest Lizzie, I have more bad news. Colonel Forster arrived, having left Brighton soon after the express. Though Lydia's note suggested Gretna Green, we fear they haven't gone there. Mr. Denny let slip that Wickham might not intend to marry Lydia at all. Colonel Forster traced them to Clapham, but lost their trail. He continued to Hertfordshire, but no one has seen them since. Our parents are in distress. My father is going to London with Colonel Forster, but he is in no state to handle this. Lizzie, I need you. Can you and our aunt and uncle come as soon as possible? My father's distress is overwhelming and he needs their help. Please, come quickly. Elizabeth leapt up, desperate to find her uncle. Just as she reached the door, it opened to reveal Mr. Darcy. He took one look at her pale, frantic face and stepped forward, concern etched on his features. Miss Bennet, what is the matter? He asked urgently. Please, let me or a servant fetch Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. You cannot go yourself in this state. Elizabeth hesitated, her legs trembling. She realized she couldn't manage on her own. She quickly instructed a servant to bring her aunt and uncle back. As the servant left, Elizabeth sank into a chair, her distress evident. Mr. Darcy, unable to leave her in such a state, spoke gently. Shall I get you a glass of wine? You look very ill. No, thank you, Elizabeth replied, trying to compose herself. I am distressed by dreadful news from Longbourn. Tears welled up in her eyes as she explained, Lydia has run away with Mr. Wickham. They are not likely headed to Scotland. My father is in London trying to find them. Oh, Mr. Darcy, I might have prevented this if only I had warned my family about Wickham. Darcy was struck with astonishment. This is indeed dreadful. Are you certain? Yes, Elizabeth confirmed, her voice shaking. They left Brighton together and were traced almost to London, but no farther. We fear the worst. Darcy's face hardened with determination. What is being done to recover her? My father is in London and we are leaving as soon as possible, but I fear it is hopeless. How can we find them? How can we persuade Wickham to do right? Darcy paced the room, deep in thought. Elizabeth could see the turmoil on his face. The gravity of her family's situation weighed heavily on her. After a moment, Darcy said, I am grieved and shocked. I wish there was something I could do to help. Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. Your concern is appreciated, Mr. Darcy. I only wish we could have prevented this. Mr. Darcy's face reflected his inner conflict, but he quickly masked it. Miss Bennet, I must apologize for my sister. We had planned to invite you to Pemberley today, but I understand you must return home. I will convey your apologies to her. Thank you, Elizabeth whispered. Please convey our apologies and explain the urgency of our departure. Darcy bowed and left the room, leaving Elizabeth to her thoughts. She knew she might never see him again under such amicable terms. Reflecting on their tumultuous relationship, she felt a pang of regret for what could have been. Elizabeth's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. She quickly explained the situation, reading Jane's letters aloud. They were horrified and immediately agreed to help. We'll leave at once, Mr. Gardiner said, comforting Elizabeth. But what about Pemberley? I've explained to Mr. Darcy that we must leave, Elizabeth replied. As they hurriedly packed, Mrs. Gardiner mused aloud. I wonder how close Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy have become. There seems to be more than just acquaintance there. Elizabeth had no time to dwell on her aunt's words. An hour later they were in the carriage, heading back to Longbourn. The weight of the morning's events hung heavily over them, but Elizabeth was determined to face whatever awaited with the support of her family. As the carriage rolled down the road, Elizabeth couldn't help but think of Mr. Darcy's earnest concern. She felt a deep sense of gratitude and, perhaps, something more. Despite the turmoil, she knew she would always cherish the kindness he had shown in her moment of need. Chapter 47. A Family in Turmoil. As their carriage rolled away from town, Elizabeth's uncle spoke up, his voice filled with thought. You know, Elizabeth, I've been mulling over everything again. After giving it serious thought, I find myself leaning more towards your sister Jane's perspective on the matter. It's just so unlikely that any young man would concoct such a scheme against a girl who isn't exactly unprotected or friendless. Especially while she was staying with Colonel Forster's family. It seems unlikely that he could expect her friends to do nothing. Could he expect to be accepted back by the regiment after such an affront to Colonel Forster? His temptation just doesn't seem to outweigh the risk. Elizabeth's eyes brightened. "Do you really think so?" Mrs. Gardner, sitting beside Elizabeth, chimed in. "I must say I'm beginning to agree with your uncle. It would be such a blatant violation of decency and honour. I find it hard to believe that Wickham could be guilty of such a thing. Can you, Lizzie, truly believe him capable of it?" Elizabeth sighed. "Perhaps not of neglecting his own interest, but of every other neglect. I can believe him capable. If that's really the case, why didn't they just go on to Scotland?" Mr. Gardner replied thoughtfully, "We don't have absolute proof they aren't in Scotland. But their change from the chaise to a hackney coach is highly suspicious, and no traces of them were found on the Barnet Road. Suppose they're in London. They could be hiding, not necessarily for any sinister purpose. They might find it more economical to marry in London than in Scotland." Elizabeth shook her head. "But why all the secrecy? Why the fear of detection? Why must their marriage be private? Wickham wouldn't marry a woman without some money. He can't afford it. What claims does Lydia have beyond youth, health, and good humour that could make him sacrifice his own future? And what restraint would the fear of disgrace in the corps place on him? I doubt it would matter to him. Lydia has no brothers to step in, and he might assume from my father's indifference that he would do as little as possible." Mrs. Gardner's voice was gentle. "But can you think Lydia is so infatuated as to live with him on any other terms than marriage?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "It's shocking, but I can't be sure. Lydia has never been taught to think seriously. For the past year, she's been given over to amusement and vanity. She's been left to herself, and we all know how charming Wickham can be." Mrs. Gardner looked thoughtful. "Jane doesn't think Wickham capable of such behaviour." Elizabeth replied bitterly. "Jane never thinks ill of anyone, but we both know what Wickham really is. He's deceitful and lacks integrity. He's as false as he is charming." Mrs. Gardner's curiosity was piqued. "And you really know all this?" Elizabeth blushed. "I do. I told you about his behaviour towards Mr. Darcy. You heard how he spoke of him when you were last at Longbourn. There are other things I can't disclose, but his lies about the Pemberley family are endless. He painted Miss Darcy as proud and disagreeable, but she's anything but—" Mrs. Gardner's eyes widened. "Does Lydia know none of this?" Elizabeth sighed. "No, she was ignorant, as I was until I went to Kent and learned the truth. When I returned, the regiment was about to leave Meryton. Jane and I didn't see the point in exposing him. What good would it do? And when Lydia went with Mrs. Forster, I never imagined she was in any danger from him." Mrs. Gardner shook her head. "When they all went to Brighton, did you see any signs of affection between them?" "None at all. Every girl in Meryton admired him at first, but he never singled out Lydia. Her admiration faded when other officers showed her more attention." Their journey back to Longbourn was filled with these discussions, but Elizabeth's mind never found peace. They travelled quickly, stopping only for one night, and arrived by dinner the next day. As they pulled into the paddock, the little Gardner children, drawn by the sight of the carriage, were dancing with joy on the steps. Elizabeth jumped out and gave each a quick kiss before rushing inside. Jane, hurrying down from their mother's room, met her with open arms. Tears filled both sisters' eyes as they embraced. Elizabeth wasted no time. "Have you heard anything about the fugitives?" Jane shook her head. "Not yet, but now that Uncle is here, I hope we'll find out something soon." "Is Father in London?" "Yes, he left on Tuesday, just as I wrote." "And have you heard from him?" "Only once. He sent a short note on Wednesday saying he'd arrived safely and gave his directions. He won't write again until there's something important to share." Elizabeth clasped her sister's hands. "And Mother, how is she? How are you all?" Jane smiled weakly. "Mother is holding up, though her spirits are shaken. She's upstairs and will be glad to see you. Mary and Kitty are well." Elizabeth gazed at her sister with concern. "But you look pale. How much you must have gone through." Jane reassured her. "I'm fine, really. The others have been a great help." Their conversation was interrupted as Mr. and Mrs. Gardner joined them. Jane greeted them with a mixture of smiles and tears. Soon, they all moved to the drawing room, where the others repeated the questions Elizabeth had asked. But Jane had no new information. Her hopeful spirit suggested that things might still end well. Upstairs, Mrs. Bennet welcomed them with tears and complaints, blaming everyone but herself for Lydia's folly. "If only I'd been allowed to go to Brighton, this wouldn't have happened. Poor Lydia had no one to look after her. And now Mr. Bennet will fight Wickham and be killed. What will become of us?" They tried to soothe her, with Mr. Gardiner promising to assist Mr. Bennet in every way possible. "Don't despair," he said. "We may still find out they are married." Mrs. Bennet's fears seemed to lessen, but she insisted. "Find them and make them marry. Lydia can have whatever she wants afterward, and keep Mr. Bennet from fighting. Tell him how distressed I am." Mr. Gardiner assured her of his efforts, recommending moderation in her hopes and fears. After dinner, they left her to pour her feelings out to the housekeeper, who was trusted with her confidences. Mary and Kitty joined them in the dining room, looking calm. Mary, ever the moralist, whispered to Elizabeth about the lessons to be learned from Lydia's folly, while Kitty's fretfulness showed her concern. Later, Elizabeth seized a private moment with Jane. They lamented the situation before Elizabeth asked for details. Jane explained Colonel Forster's suspicions and efforts, though no one had anticipated such an outcome. Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt. "If only we'd shared what we knew about Wickham." Jane nodded. "Perhaps, but we acted with the best intentions." They discussed their father's plans in London, hoping he might trace the hackney coach. Jane's description of the chaos at home and her father's distress made Elizabeth wish she'd been there to help. In the midst of their worries, Elizabeth found solace in being home, surrounded by family. Though the future was uncertain, the warmth of their love and support provided a glimmer of hope in the dark. Chapter 48. Waiting for News. The Bennet family, along with their guests, were on edge, hoping for a letter from Mr. Bennet the next morning. However, the post came and went without bringing any news. Mr. Bennet was known to be a negligent and slow correspondent, but given the gravity of the situation, they had hoped he would make an effort. They were forced to conclude that he had no good news to share. Still, they would have preferred even bad news to the continued uncertainty. Mr. Gardiner had waited only for the letters before setting off to London. Once he left, the family at least knew they would receive regular updates from him. He promised to convince Mr. Bennet to return to Longbourn as soon as possible, much to Mrs. Bennet's relief, as she feared for her husband's safety and the potential of him engaging in a duel. Mrs. Gardiner and the children stayed on in Hertfordshire for a few more days, believing her presence would be comforting to her nieces. She shared in the task of tending to Mrs. Bennet and brought much-needed calm during their moments of anxiety. Their other aunt visited frequently, aiming to cheer them up, though she often left them more disheartened with her reports of Wickham's misdeeds. Meryton buzzed with gossip, everyone eager to tarnish the name of the man who had once been regarded so highly. Every shopkeeper claimed he was in debt, and every family had a tale of his so-called seductions. The entire town now saw Wickham as the most wicked young man in existence, though Elizabeth believed only half of what she heard. Even Jane, ever hopeful, found it hard to remain optimistic, especially since any news from Scotland would have surfaced by now if that had been their destination. Mr. Gardiner left on Sunday, and by Tuesday, Mrs. Gardiner received a letter from him. He had found Mr. Bennet and persuaded him to stay with them at Gracechurch Street. Mr. Bennet had searched Epsom and Clapham before Mr. Gardiner arrived, but without any success. He now planned to visit all the principal hotels in London, hoping Lydia and Wickham might have stayed at one before finding lodgings. Mr. Gardiner doubted this would yield results, but agreed to help his brother-in-law. In his letter, Mr. Gardiner mentioned he had written to Colonel Forster to inquire if any of Wickham's acquaintances might know his whereabouts. He added a postscript asking if Elizabeth could provide any information on Wickham's family. Elizabeth, understanding the compliment in his request, was disappointed she had no useful information to offer. She had only ever heard of Wickham's deceased parents and no other family. It was possible someone in his regiment might know more, but she wasn't optimistic. Days at Longbourn were filled with anxiety, each morning's post bringing either hope or disappointment. Before they heard again from Mr. Gardiner, a letter arrived for Mr. Bennet from Mr. Collins. Jane, instructed to open all letters in her father's absence, read it aloud, with Elizabeth peering over her shoulder. Dear Sir, I feel compelled by our relationship and my position to express my condolences on the grievous affliction you are enduring, which we learned about from a letter from Hertfordshire. Rest assured, my dear sir, that Mrs. Collins and I deeply sympathise with you and your respectable family in this distress, the most bitter kind, since it stems from a cause no time can erase. I shall not lack in arguments to alleviate this severe misfortune or comfort you in such an affliction. The death of your daughter would have been a blessing in comparison. This is even more lamentable, as my dear Charlotte informs me, because it seems this licentious behaviour in your daughter arises from excessive indulgence. For your consolation, I believe her disposition must be naturally flawed to commit such an enormity at such a young age. However, you are grievously to be pitied, in which Mrs. Collins, Lady Catherine, and her daughter agree with me. They concur that this misstep by one daughter will harm the fortunes of all the others. Lady Catherine herself condescendingly said, "Who will connect with such a family?" This leads me to reflect with increased satisfaction on a certain event last November. Had it been otherwise, I would be sharing in your sorrow and disgrace. Let me advise you, dear sir, to disown your unworthy child, and leave her to face the consequences of her actions. I am, dear sir, etc., etc. Mr. Gardiner's next letter provided little comfort. Wickham appeared to have no living relations, and though he had many acquaintances, none were on particularly close terms with him. Wickham's financial state was dire, with gaming debts and other significant expenses. Colonel Forster estimated over £1,000 would be needed to settle his debts in Brighton alone. Mr. Gardiner's letter mentioned Mr. Bennet would return home the next day, Saturday. He had reluctantly agreed to leave the search to Mr. Gardiner, feeling defeated by the lack of progress. When Mrs. Bennet heard this, she was less pleased than expected. "What? He's coming home without poor Lydia," she cried. "He cannot leave London without finding them. Who will fight Wickham and make him marry her?" Mrs. Gardiner decided to return to London with her children when Mr. Bennet arrived. The coach took them the first stage of their journey and brought Mr. Bennet back to Longbourn. Mrs. Gardiner left with lingering curiosity about Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. Despite the current family turmoil, she wondered if their acquaintance might develop further. Elizabeth had received no letters from Pemberley, and the family crisis overshadowed any thoughts of romance. When Mr. Bennet arrived, he appeared composed, but said little about his time in London. It was some time before his daughters had the courage to broach the subject. Elizabeth finally mentioned it during tea. "Father, I am so sorry for what you've been through," she said softly. "Say nothing of that," he replied. "It's my own doing. I ought to feel it." "You mustn't be too hard on yourself," Elizabeth urged. "Human nature is prone to fall into it," he replied. "No, Lizzie. Let me once feel my fault. It will pass soon enough." "Do you think they are in London?" she asked. "Yes, where else could they be?" he replied. "Lydia always wanted to go to London," added Kitty. "She's happy then," said Mr. Bennet dryly, "and her stay there will probably be long." After a pause he continued, "Lizzie, I hold no ill will for your advice last May. You showed great wisdom." They were interrupted by Jane, who came to fetch her mother's tea. Mr. Bennet, ever the cynic, remarked, "This parade gives elegance to misfortune. Another day I'll sit in my library, in my nightcap, and give as much trouble as I can, perhaps until Kitty runs away." "I'm not going to run away, Papa," Kitty said fretfully. "If I ever go to Brighton, I'd behave better than Lydia." "You go to Brighton? I wouldn't trust you near Eastbourne for £50. No, Kitty, I've learned caution. No officers are to enter my house again, nor will balls be allowed unless you dance with your sisters. and you are not to leave the house until you can prove you've spent 10 minutes a day rationally." Kitty, taking his threats seriously, began to cry. "Don't make yourself unhappy," he said. "If you're good for 10 years, I'll take you to a review at the end." The days of waiting continued, filled with anxiety and uncertainty. But through it all, the Bennet family held on to hope and each other, finding strength in their shared love and resilience. Chapter 49. News from London. It was a bright, crisp morning, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers as Jane and Elizabeth strolled together in the shrubbery behind Longbourn House. The sun peeked through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the path. The sisters chatted softly, enjoying the peaceful moment. Suddenly, they noticed Mrs. Hill, the housekeeper, hurrying towards them, her face a mix of hope and concern. "Good morning, Mrs. Hill," Jane greeted warmly. "Is everything all right?" The housekeeper, slightly out of breath, replied, "I beg your pardon for interrupting, Miss Bennet, but I was hoping you might have some good news from town. I took the liberty of coming to ask." "What do you mean, Hill? We haven't heard anything from town," Elizabeth said, puzzled. "Dear madam," Mrs. Hill exclaimed, eyes wide with astonishment, "don't you know there's an express come for master from Mr. Gardiner? He's been here this half hour, and master has had a letter." The sisters exchanged a quick glance, excitement and worry mingling in their eyes. Without another word, they dashed towards the house, their skirts rustling as they ran through the vestibule into the breakfast room and then to the library. But their father was nowhere to be found. "If you're looking for my master, ma'am, he's walking towards the little copse," the butler informed them as they whirled through the hall once more. Thanking him, they hurried across the lawn, spotting Mr. Bennet leisurely making his way towards a small wood on one side of the paddock. Jane, not as accustomed to running as Elizabeth, soon lagged behind while Elizabeth, breathless but determined, caught up with her father. "Oh, Papa, what news? What news? Have you heard from my uncle?" she panted. Mr. Bennet, looking rather amused at his daughter's breathless state, replied, "Yes, I have had a letter from him by express." "Well, and what news does it bring, good or bad?" Elizabeth asked eagerly. "What is there of good to be expected?" he said, pulling the letter from his pocket. "But perhaps you would like to read it." Elizabeth snatched the letter from his hand, her heart pounding. By this time Jane had caught up, and Mr. Bennet suggested, "Read it aloud, for I hardly know myself what it is about." Elizabeth unfolded the letter, her hands trembling slightly, and began to read. "Gracechurch Street, Monday, August 2nd. My dear brother, at last I'm able to send you some tidings of my niece, and such as, upon the whole, I hope will give you satisfaction. Soon after you left me on Saturday, I was fortunate enough to find out in what part of London they were. The particulars I reserve till we meet. It is enough to know they are discovered. I have seen them both." "They are married!" Jane exclaimed, her face lighting up with relief. Elizabeth continued reading. "They are not married, nor can I find there was any intention of being so. But if you are willing to perform the engagements which I have ventured to make on your side, I hope it will not be long before they are. All that is required of you is to assure to your daughter by settlement her equal share of the £5,000, secured among your children after the decease of yourself and my sister, and moreover to enter into an engagement of allowing her, during your life, £100 per annum. These are conditions which, considering everything, I had no hesitation in complying with, as far as I thought myself privileged, for you. I shall send this by express that no time may be lost in bringing me your answer. You will easily comprehend from these particulars that Mr. Wickham's circumstances are not so hopeless as they are generally believed to be. The world has been deceived in that respect, and I am happy to say there will be some little money, even when all his debts are discharged, to settle on my niece, in addition to her own fortune. If, as I conclude will be the case, you send me full powers to act in your name throughout the whole of this business, I will immediately give directions to Haggerston for preparing a proper settlement. There will not be the smallest occasion for your coming to town again. Therefore, stay quietly at Longbourn and depend on my diligence and care. Send back your answer as soon as you can, and be careful to write explicitly. We have judged it best that my niece should be married from this house, of which I hope you will approve. She comes to us today. I shall write again as soon as anything more is determined on. Yours, etc., EDW, Gardiner. Elizabeth looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. Is it possible? Can it be possible that he will marry her? Jane, always ready to see the good in others, said softly, Wickham is not so undeserving, then, as we have thought him. My dear father, I congratulate you. And have you answered the letter? Elizabeth asked anxiously. No, but it must be done soon, Mr. Bennet replied, his tone still rather detached. Elizabeth pleaded, Oh, my dear father, come back and write immediately. Consider how important every moment is in such a case. Jane offered, Let me write for you, if you dislike the trouble yourself. I dislike it very much, he admitted with a small smile, but it must be done. Turning back, he walked with them towards the house. Elizabeth couldn't help but ask, And, may I ask? But the terms, I suppose, must be complied with. Complied with? I'm only ashamed of his asking so little, Mr. Bennet said with a wry chuckle. And they must marry. Yet he is such a man, Elizabeth murmured, shaking her head. Yes, yes, they must marry. There is nothing else to be done. But there are two things that I want very much to know. One is, how much money your uncle has laid down to bring it about, and the other, how I am ever to pay him. Money, my uncle, cried Jane. What do you mean, sir? I mean that no man in his proper senses would marry Lydia on so slight a temptation as 100 a year during my life, and 50 after I am gone, Mr. Bennet explained. That is very true, said Elizabeth, though it had not occurred to me before. His debts to be discharged, and something still to remain. Oh, it must be my uncle's doings. Generous, good man. I am afraid he has distressed himself. A small sum could not do all this. No, agreed her father. Wickham's a fool if he takes her with a farthing less than £10,000. I should be sorry to think so ill of him in the very beginning of our relationship. £10,000! Heaven forbid! How is half such a sum to be repaid? Elizabeth exclaimed. Mr. Bennet made no answer, and the trio, deep in thought, continued in silence until they reached the house. Mr. Bennet went directly to the library to write, while the girls walked into the breakfast-room. And they are really to be married, cried Elizabeth, once they were alone. How strange this is! And for this we are to be thankful, that they should marry, small as is their chance of happiness, and wretched as is his character, we are forced to rejoice. Oh, Lydia! Jane, ever the optimist, replied, I comfort myself with thinking that he certainly would not marry Lydia if he did not have a real regard for her. Though our kind uncle has done something towards clearing him, I cannot believe that £10,000, or anything like it, has been advanced. He has children of his own, and may have more. How could he spare half £10,000? If we ever learn what Wickham's debts have been, said Elizabeth, and how much is settled on our sister, we shall know exactly what Mr. Gardiner has done for them. Wickham has not sixpence of his own. The kindness of my uncle and aunt can never be repaid. Their taking her home and providing her with protection is such a sacrifice. By now, she's actually with them. If such goodness does not make her miserable now, she will never deserve to be happy. We must endeavour to forget all that has passed, said Jane. I hope and trust they will yet be happy. His consenting to marry her is proof that he has come to a right way of thinking. Their mutual affection will steady them. I flatter myself they will settle quietly and live in a manner that may make their past imprudence forgotten. Elizabeth sighed. Their conduct has been such as neither you, nor I, nor anybody can ever forget. It is useless to talk of it. The girls then remembered their mother was likely unaware of the news. They went to the library and asked their father if he wished them to inform her. Without looking up from his writing, he said, Just as you please. May we take my uncle's letter to read to her? Elizabeth asked. "Take whatever you like and get away," he replied, waving them off. With the letter in hand, they headed upstairs to Mrs. Bennet's room, where Mary and Kitty were also present. After a brief preamble, Jane read the letter aloud. Mrs. Bennet could hardly contain herself. As soon as Jane read Mr. Gardiner's hope of Lydia's impending marriage, her joy overflowed. "My dear, dear Lydia," she cried, "she will be married. I shall see her again. She will be married at 16. My good, kind brother. I knew he would manage everything. How I long to see her, and to see dear Wickham too. But the clothes, the wedding clothes. I will write to my sister Gardiner about them directly. Lizzie, run down to your father and ask him how much he will give her. No, wait, I will go myself. Kitty, ring the bell for Hill. I will put on my things in a moment. My dear, dear Lydia, how merry we shall be together when we meet." Jane gently tried to temper her mother's excitement. "We must be grateful to Uncle Gardiner for his kindness. We believe he has pledged himself to assist Mr. Wickham with money." "Well," cried Mrs. Bennet, "who should do it but her own uncle? If he had not had a family of his own, I and my children would have had all his money, and it is the first time we have ever had anything from him except a few presents. I am so happy. In a short time I shall have a daughter married. Mrs. Wickham, how well it sounds! And she was only 16 last June. Jane, I am in such a flutter, I can't write. You must do it for me. We will settle with your father about the money afterwards. The things should be ordered immediately." She began listing the necessary wedding clothes, dictating orders for calico, muslin, and cambric. Jane, though, managed to persuade her to wait until their father could be consulted, noting that a day's delay would not be significant. Mrs. Bennet's mind then turned to sharing the good news. "I will go to Meryton as soon as I'm dressed and tell my sister Phillips. On the way back, I can call on Lady Lucas and Mrs. Long. Kitty, order the carriage. An airing would do me a great deal of good. Girls, do you need anything from Meryton? Oh, here comes Hill. Have you heard the good news, Hill? Miss Lydia is going to be married, and you shall all have a bowl of punch to celebrate her wedding." Mrs. Hill began expressing her joy immediately. Elizabeth, however, feeling overwhelmed by her mother's exuberance, excused herself to her room. There, she could think freely about the situation. Lydia's prospects were still troubling, but Elizabeth was thankful they weren't as dire as they'd feared just hours ago. Though rational happiness or worldly prosperity seemed unlikely for her sister, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel relief and gratitude for what had been gained. Chapter 50, Reflections and Realizations. Mr. Bennet had often regretted not saving a portion of his income each year for his children's future, and for Mrs. Bennet, should she outlive him. Now, more than ever, he wished he had done so. If he had been more prudent, Lydia wouldn't need to rely on her uncle for any semblance of honour or credit that could now be salvaged for her. The idea that one of the most irresponsible young men in Britain would become her husband could have been handled within their family means. He felt a deep concern that such a worthless cause would fall entirely on the shoulders of his brother-in-law, and he was determined to discover the extent of the help provided and repay the debt as soon as possible. When Mr. Bennet first married, the notion of saving was deemed unnecessary. They were to have a son who would cut off the entail and provide for the widow and younger children. Despite 5 daughters arriving one after another, Mrs. Bennet had clung to the hope of a son long after Lydia's birth. This hope had faded too late to encourage thriftiness. Mrs. Bennet had no inclination towards economy, and only Mr. Bennet's desire for independence had kept their spending in check. £5,000 had been settled on Mrs. Bennet and the children through marriage articles, but how it was divided depended on the parents. This issue, especially concerning Lydia, was now to be addressed. Mr. Bennet, in a concise but grateful letter, expressed his full approval of the arrangements made and his willingness to fulfil the commitments on his behalf. He had never imagined Wickham would marry Lydia with so little inconvenience to himself. The costs, when offset by Lydia's regular expenses, meant the family would hardly notice the financial impact. The news spread quickly through the house and the neighbourhood. The neighbours, though accepting the marriage with decent philosophy, would have found more to discuss had Lydia been sequestered in a remote farmhouse or fallen into disgrace. Marrying her to Wickham provided ample fodder for gossip and ensured that spiteful old ladies in Meryton could still find a perverse satisfaction in predicting her future misery with such a husband. Mrs. Bennet, who had been bedridden for a fortnight, returned to her place at the head of the table on this joyful day, her spirits unrestrained. No shame dampened her triumph. Having a daughter married, her foremost wish since Jane was 16 was now about to be fulfilled. Her thoughts and words were filled with the trappings of a grand wedding. Fine muslins, new carriages, and servants. She eagerly searched the neighbourhood for an appropriate residence for Lydia and Wickham, disregarding their actual income. Hay Park might work, she mused, if the Gouldings would move out, or the great house at Stoke, if the drawing-room were larger. But Ashworth is too far away, and Purvis Lodge has dreadful attics. Mr. Bennet let her chatter on while the servants were present. Once they were alone, he addressed her firmly. Mrs. Bennet, before you decide on any of these houses for Lydia and Wickham, understand this, they will never be admitted to Longbourn. I won't encourage their imprudence by receiving them here. A lengthy argument ensued, but Mr. Bennet remained steadfast. This led to another dispute when Mrs. Bennet realised he would not provide any money for Lydia's wedding clothes. He insisted she would receive no mark of affection from him on this occasion, which Mrs. Bennet found incomprehensible. The idea that his anger would extend to denying Lydia new clothes for her wedding was beyond her belief, more disgraceful to her than Lydia's elopement and cohabitation with Wickham. Elizabeth regretted confiding in Mr. Darcy about Lydia's situation. With the marriage concluding soon, they might have hoped to keep the elopement's details hidden. She trusted Darcy's discretion, but was deeply embarrassed by the thought of him knowing about her sister's folly. It was not for fear of personal disadvantage, but rather the realization that any hope of a relationship with Darcy was now impossible. She had assured herself of his regard in Derbyshire, but this scandal would surely extinguish that. Elizabeth reflected on how well suited she and Darcy could have been. Their union would have been beneficial to both, his judgment and knowledge, complementing her liveliness and ease. But now, with Lydia's marriage casting a shadow over her family, any hope for such a match was lost. She understood that passion and virtue were not strong enough to sustain Lydia and Wickham's union, predicting little happiness for them. Mr. Gardiner soon wrote to Mr. Bennet, briefly replying to his gratitude and requesting the matter never be mentioned again. The main point of his letter was that Wickham had decided to leave the militia and join the regulars, with assistance from former friends in the army. Mr. Gardiner hoped that moving away and starting anew might lead to a more prudent lifestyle for both Wickham and Lydia. Mrs. Bennet was disappointed with this plan. She had envisioned Lydia nearby, revelling in the company and the social scene. Moving to the north meant leaving behind friends and familiar faces. Lydia was very fond of Mrs. Forster and several young officers, and Mrs. Bennet lamented the change. Lydia requested a visit to Longbourn before heading north, which Mr. Bennet initially refused. However, Jane and Elizabeth, considering Lydia's feelings and the need to show parental acknowledgement of her marriage, persuaded him to allow the visit. Mrs. Bennet was delighted to showcase her married daughter before she left for the north. Elizabeth, though not looking forward to seeing Wickham, was surprised he agreed to the visit. And so the Bennet family braced for the next chapter in their lives, filled with a mixture of regret, hope, and the unyielding bonds of family.
This is the end of Part 5 of Pride and Prejudice, reimagined in the style of best-selling romance author Carolyn Brown. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. You can hear the exciting conclusion of this classic story in Part 6 on the Classic Books Reimagined channel.